Our penultimate speaker is going to give us the industry perspective on this issue. So from GE Energy, we have Magued Eldaief, Executive Director of Energy Accounts at GE Energy. He leads a number of key global accounts, and he is also the Managing Director of GE Energy in the UK. So, welcome.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to say that we're very pleased to be supporting this forum here for Imperial, because I think you're going to play a very important role, I think, in this debate as well, especially from our perspective, which is technology development and evolution. So what I would like to do, I think, for this discussion is to give you the perspective from industry, from GE, as to how we see the reality of the energy world that we live in. And then I would also like to give it to you from a perspective of a company that is really involved in every single aspect of the energy value chain. So today we are a $50 billion company that is involved from everything from the wellhead in the subsea where we get the oil out, all the way up to the meter at home or in the factory in order to measure the amount of electricity that's being consumed. Of course, GE's heritage goes all the way back 130 years with Thomas Edison, who invented electricity and the light bulb. And I think today, you know, if you take a look at that value chain, we've grown the company substantially over that time frame. And again, complete portfolio. So the key point here is we're agnostic in terms of technology. We do not favor nuclear versus renewable versus fossil. We think that all technologies are required in order to be able to meet the requirements, I think, of the future, and as Professor Ekins mentioned, GDP growth. Okay, so for us as a business, we have a very important decision to make. Where do we invest our resources and our money in terms of development? And we need to plan ahead. Our business is a long cycle business. Therefore, if we are going to invent a new power generation type technology, it takes us decades in order to do that and billions of dollars to do it. So we need to have some certainty in terms of where do we put that investment, and are we going to get a return on that investment? So I think one of the debates, for example, which is closer to home here in the UK, is investment in offshore wind. Today I announced maybe two and a half years ago that we are willing to invest almost £100 million in a new facility to make wind turbines, offshore wind turbines to be specific, here in the UK. But today that investment is on hold because of a very uncertain policy, which frankly is the one that will enable our customers to buy from us and justify that investment. So today we cannot justify it. We need to have some clarity longer term for us to make that kind of decision. So for us, the uncertainties, when we look out 10, 15 years ahead, these are the uncertainties. I think some of them have already been mentioned before. GDP growth, clearly, if the economy is not doing well, that's going to have an impact. Pace of innovation, I think, is a very important part of this whole discussion. If I go back and take a look at wind, today wind is mainstream because one country decided to put a lot of investment into that and create a market for it. And that country 25 years ago was Germany. So Germany really is the one that kick-started that whole effort. Because they created a market, others came in and started investing. And wind today, where you see the cost of wind, maybe it was, at that point of time, maybe 25 cents per kilowatt hour. Today, wind is almost competitive with fossil for good wind sites. So it's gone down dramatically. The question is, will it happen for solar energy and for some of the other tidal and others that I think are being discussed? And what's the time frame or time horizon for those costs to come down? The other key point I want to mention here is nobody talks about water. I think Professor Ekins mentioned in his discussion the drought in the U.S. People don't realize that out of all the water, out of the total water consumption in the United States, 65% of it is not for agriculture, it's for power generation. 65%. So water is taken for granted, I think, in the energy space, and this is something that we also need to address. So I'll tell you where we think some of the trends and where they're headed. I think the first trend is gas is going to increase. It's inevitable. And I'll tell you why that's the case. But in the next 15 years, gas consumption is going to increase. The good news is there is plenty of gas. I think with the discovery of shale gas three to 4 years ago in the U.S., today we can recover it more economically. So shale gas is going to play an important part not only in the U.S. but in other parts of the world, and that obviously is going to drive it. The other key factor for driving gas is cost. So cost today, when you think about what gas price is, Europe it's a little bit high, but in the U.S. it's gone down at least by half or more, and will continue to be so in the near term. So price, again, the economics of energy have to be taken into account in this discussion. I think the second key trend is the fact that capacity, electricity generation or power generation capacity will have to increase, and especially in the emerging markets. So we think the emerging markets are going to grow much, much faster, and I'll show you what our view is of that growth. But that also is good in terms of gas, because you cannot have renewables on its own. You need to have renewables and gas very well integrated. When the wind is not blowing, the only clean alternative is to have gas as backup. Not coal, but gas. And gas is much more flexible from that perspective. You can ramp plants up and down so they can work very well and be integrated very well with wind. And we also think from a technology perspective, gas can be very well integrated with solar as well. The third trend is really all about the IT infrastructure around energy. When we talk about smart grid, I don't know what smart grid. The only definition that I have for smart grid is it's our ability to manage better using modern IT systems, the energy infrastructure that we have. And unfortunately, the pace of innovation there has not been very rapid over the last few years, or decades, I should say. So this is something that we see as a big trend. We're investing into it because we think that that's going to be very important, not only for new assets, for new power plants, but for the existing assets. There's a lot of aging infrastructure, especially in transmission and distribution today, that is almost 100 years old, from the time of Thomas Edison, which is still operating. How do you make sure that it's going to be reliable? How do you make sure it's efficient? Because when we talk about energy efficiency, the least cost way to reduce efficiency or to improve efficiency is to work on what you've got, working on the T&D. If you can save or you can transmit that power more efficiently, that's the least cost alternative today that we have. So what's the path forward? When we do our strategic thinking, we think of scenarios, different scenarios. This is probably the bleakest of the scenarios, what we call the global grind, which means that it's a low-growth world, weak commodity and fuel prices, and of course, environment is really taking the back seat in that whole debate. Environment is not as important. Survival, making sure that you have the lights are on, is more important than worrying about reducing CO2 emissions. And of course, in that sort of environment, trade protectionism is very high. Okay? Now, what's the most optimistic is what we call fast blue. And fast blue, where we have more gas in that energy mix, where growth is going to resume. Natural gas, as I mentioned, is going to flourish. And then that whole digital wave around the energy infrastructure is going to help and improve the efficiency. And then water stewardship as well as awareness is going to be very much something that is taken into that whole debate and is not ignored as it is today. So I mentioned gas. The old way of thinking about gas is that it was a bridge fuel. Today it's a destination fuel, and I mentioned the reasons why, because it is abundant, because it's cost effective today, because I think the geopolitical concerns around where do I get gas from? Am I dependent on Russia? For example, in Europe for gas, I think today when you take a look at all of the finds for gas off the coast of Africa, whether it's east or west or other parts of the world like Australia, There's plenty of it certainly to go around. And countries like Japan, for example, today that have decided to get out of nuclear because of Fukushima, if they still want to meet their environmental and CO2 obligations, they can't really be adding too many coal-fired power plants. Renewables is going to still be limited, so they're going to have to turn into gas, and they're going to have to they're going to have to import it from either Asia or places like Australia and the Middle East or Africa. So the way we look at the world today with regards to the discussion on emerging economies is it's a three-speed world. There are countries in that equation that are growing very slowly. There are countries that are of moderate growth. And then there are countries in the green, as shown on the chart, which we call the high flyers, which have GDP growth of 5 to 6+%. And those are the countries where we're going to see a lot of that growth and demand. And I think that those are the countries as well where we need to talk about more actively, what do we need to do for the energy mix. I think Brazil is a great example of what they have done in terms of making sure that they have a sustainable energy mix that takes into account the environment. There are other countries like China which also play a very, very important role in that whole debate because of their torrid pace of GDP growth. So I'm going to end maybe with a couple of slides here because I have this discussion quite a bit with the UK government here, with ministers, about what does it take in order for technology to evolve and to create a market. And basically, it's four things. From a business perspective, for us to invest, these are the four things. And I highlighted three different countries or markets to give you a perspective on where, for example, Europe is with regards to China, with regards to the US. The first one is you need a marketplace. For companies the size of GE, there's 4 or 5 big energy players like GE. If they're going to make investments, they're going to make big investments. They need a big market in order to recapture again or to get payback on that investment. So we need a marketplace for it. So when we talk about offshore wind, it cannot be a few hundred turbines, a market of a few hundred turbines. It has to be thousands. Okay? That's the reality of it. Okay? Investment in technology. And is that investment coordinated? So today we think technology is very important for us to invest in, and it's not only in developed markets, but in emerging markets. Since we have Brazil here, GE is opening up a research facility in Brazil, in Rio, to tap into the Brazilian, if you will, brains and universities. We have the same in India, we have the same in China, but that game, again, of technology is not coming only out of Europe and out of the US. It's a global, I think, technology game, and it has to be well coordinated from an industry perspective as well. The third one is a scalable and competitive supply chain. As I mentioned to you, any technology today is not going to become mainstream unless it's competitive. Wind is mainstream because it's gone down in cost. Solar is becoming more mainstream because it's gone down in cost. If tidal, for example, is going to become mainstream, it has to be cost competitive with the fossil alternative. There's no other way, because at the end of the day, the consumers are the ones that are going to pay. We talk about subsidies, but the subsidy, who's going to pay the subsidy? It's the consumer. And are the consumers today in a very limited or depressed economic environment, are they willing to pay 20 to 30% more for that kilowatt hour of electricity? As we've seen in many places, that's not the case. Okay? That's not the case. And then the last one is public policy, which I think is the one where we get actively involved in very much, but I think is fundamental for any of this to happen. If you don't have a stable subsidy mechanism for at least 20 to 25 years, you're not going to have those investments. When you create or you transition or you try to reinvent, as has been happening here in the UK, that creates uncertainty in the minds of investors, and unfortunately it does not drive that technology development and market. So I'll end with this. I think for the next 15 years, I think the energy system constraints are intensifying. The problem in our energy industry is you cannot decide today that you want to put a power plant, wake up tomorrow and do it. You have to plan for it. You have to take time in order to figure out where it's going to be. all of the environmental assessments, the feasibility studies, all of that, and to construct it. So it's a 5 to 10 year cycle. And in that period, if you don't plan ahead in advance and have that certainty, a lot of things can happen. And that obviously will put some more strains on the system. Shale gas, I think, is here to stay. It's going to have global implications. I mentioned technology and smart policy, especially with things related to another resource which we're taking for granted today, water, which needs to be part of the debate. We need to have a much better industrial internet around that, around the energy infrastructure that we have, because that's going to be key to get more, to reduce emissions and to improve the efficiency of the infrastructure that we have. And I think, frankly, emerging economies are in a much better position to lead. If I go back to this chart and I look at China, but China, frankly, people don't realize they are investing quite a bit in new technology. If you take a look at, I'll just give you one fact. Globally, there is maybe, in terms of wind players, we have maybe a dozen key wind players globally, like GE. In China, there's over 70. Okay, 70. So it just gives you an idea of the difference. And those 70 are very aggressive, very hungry. They're going to go and they want to obviously develop technology, but also go outside of China in order to go and build their business elsewhere. So I'm happy to take questions after this, so thank you very much for taking the time to listen.